We are diving deep today into the expected narrative shape of the upcoming film Doomsday, specifically by looking backward. We're going to analyze the established directorial signatures and, the structural blueprints the Russo brothers have consistently laid down, particularly in their massive narratives like Infinity War and Endgame.
And what we're trying to do here is, well, it's highly complex. We're trying to predict the future of this huge reality-altering event by weighing two competing forces. Is it the reliable framework of their past films, or is it the radical high-stakes mythological shifts that all the newer content is signaling?
Exactly, that is attention. So the central question is whether our predictions for Doomsday should prioritize those established, predictable cinematic patterns, the character journey, the structural twists, the mandatory cold openings that the Russos, they consistently employ. My argument is that these structural patterns are the most reliable indicators of the film's shape, regardless of the mythology underneath.
See, I come at it from a different way. While those structural beats are probably the scaffolding, the actual substance and dramatic weight of Doomsday has to be defined by the conceptually ambitious, the massive mythological shifts that are implied by all the emerging lore. We're talking about the cosmic roots of the incursions and the fact that the rules of reality are now, they're fundamentally unstable. The pattern is just the container. The mythology is the volatile payload.
Okay, so let's start with the most reliable pattern, the narrative shape. If you trace the Russo brothers' trajectory, from Winter Soldier all the way through Endgame, there's a non-negotiable common theme, and that is the journey. Winter Soldier was a journey into paranoia. Civil War, a difficult journey of division. Infinity War was Thanos' relentless journey. Endgame was the Avengers' final journey of sacrifice. This structural pattern is absolutely guaranteed for Doomsday, and based on, the obvious thematic implication, that journey is guaranteed to be Dr. Doom's.
The predictability of the journey as an organizing principle is sound, I'll give you that. But I think the nature of Doom's unique objective fundamentally shifts the complexity of that structure, making it way less linear than Thanos's was.
That's precisely where the second critical pattern comes in, defining how Doom will execute his journey. Unlike Thanos, who is a straightforward brute force crusader, Doom will be defined by manipulation, by intellectual prowess and trickery. This is a villain archetype the Russos have deployed with, immense success before. You can draw a straight line from this back to Zemo in Civil War. Zemo didn't use power, he used gaslighting and carefully orchestrated deceit to divide Tony and Steve.
So you're arguing Doom functions as an exponential Zemo, a powerful mastermind rather than a simple warlord.
Exactly, and that makes him far more dangerous. Furthermore, this pattern dictates a highly personal plot to kick things off. Doom's quest has to begin with a targeted attack, a cold opening focused on vengeance against Steve Rogers. Doom will believe that Steve initiated the whole multiverse crisis by choosing to stay in the past, which directly resulted in the incursions that caused Doom to lose someone close to him. It grounds the chaos in a structural, emotional conflict that anchors the audience.
I appreciate that focus on pattern recognition, I really do, particularly the Zemo misdirection. But frankly, reducing the incursions, a reality-breaking cosmic event, to a simple Zemo-style personal vendetta, however successful that pattern was before, it just feels like narrative regression. My position is that the high-level conceptual complexity supersedes those predictable beats. The core issue here isn't personal vengeance, it's the conceptual truth that the multiverse crisis is described as being planned by beyond us.
And for those less immersed in the deep mythological references, what exactly do you mean by beyond us?
Well, I'm referencing the subtle signals pointing toward the Beyonders, these high-concept, omnipotent entities operating outside the standard structure of space and time. So if the source of conflict is these cosmic forces, it means the destruction was fundamentally destined, unavoidable by mortal means. If the crisis is conceptually cosmic and pre-planned, that means Doom's primary mission can't just be settling a personal score. It has to be finding the true root of the incursions.
But every journey, structurally, needs a strong emotional inciting incident to launch the first act. Even if the goal is cosmic, the driver has to be personal.
I agree that the structural requirement for a driver exists, sure, but that driver has to serve the conceptual core, not overwrite it.
If Doom concludes the destruction was destined, triggered by forces beyond mortal control, his aim leads not to a battle, but to a conceptual fix, a restructuring of reality itself. And we see strong evidence of this in the bizarre team-up we know is coming between Doctor Strange and Doctor Doom. Strange is convinced to join Doom's plan. That's an intellectual, philosophical alliance. It suggests Doom's agenda is far grander than taking out one former Avenger. He's arguing for a terrible, complex truth that Strange has to concede to.
I see why you emphasize that. But let me return to the structural necessity of that cold opening. If the Russo pattern holds, the beginning needs to be shocking, highly visual, and establish the stakes immediately, much like Infinity War opened on the wreckage of Thor's ship and Loki's death. I predict the film opens exactly when Steve Rogers is enjoying his earned domesticity. With Peggy, maybe with family.
Domesticity interrupted.
Classic
Structural bait.
Precisely. Doom appears out of nowhere and targets Steve, not necessarily to kill him, but to initiate the confrontation. He explains his motive, that Steve chose to stay in the past, initiating the branching that created this whole crisis. This establishes the personal stakes for Doom, which structurally legitimizes his monstrous actions later on. This vengeance plot against the first connection, Steve, is essential to anchor the vastness of the conflict.
That's a structurally compelling argument for an emotional hook. But have you considered how secondary that act of vengeance might be to Doom's real ambition? While the attack on Steve provides that visceral opening, it might just serve the larger, cold cosmic imperative. Doom is obsessed with gaining systemic power over the entire multiverse, far surpassing figures like Loki on the throne of the TVA. His true focus is on powerful assets like Franklin Richards, whom he's clearly pursuing to manipulate or harness. Targeting Steve Rogers is secondary to achieving that greater power. Steve is a symbol of the mess, not the target of the fix.
But if the goal is systemic power, the methodology remains the Zemo parallel, manipulation and division. Doom's objective isn't a frontal assault. It's using trickery to divide the forces of various multiverses against each other, setting up that massive Avengers versus X-Men battle. This divisive action sequence is structurally necessary for the Russos to get their signature parallel narrative, like the fights on Wakanda and Titan in Infinity War. And the twist dictated by the pattern is that Doom may not even be present. He's conducting his own journey, far away from the chaos he engineered.
Okay, I agree with the parallel action and Doom's manipulative absence, but I would frame the motive for that manipulation differently. If the lore is correct and Doom knows the crisis is planned by beyond us and can't be stopped, his manipulation is aimed not at conquest, but at survival. A temporary fix over several years, as alluded to in the texts.
If he's only aiming for a temporary fix, doesn't that fundamentally reduce the stakes? Structural narratives demand a permanent objective.
Not if the permanent objective is survival in a universe destined for death. The Strange Doom Alliance highlights this. Strange is convinced because he recognizes that salvation requires absolute sacrifice, a callback to him surrendering the Time Stone in Infinity War. This suggests Doom's manipulation isn't crude deceit. It's the act of convincing highly intelligent beings of a terrible, complex, existential threat that necessitates morally extreme action. It's persuasion based on cosmic fact.
Whether it's crude deceit or sophisticated truth, the methodology is still designed to acquire the McGuffin, which drives the conflict in this kind of Russo structure. The continuity demands a clear replacement for the Infinity Stones. We already have strong indications that Doom will use Franklin Richards' power, the ability to manipulate reality, to take over the multiverse. Franklin is the McGuffin. This focus on acquiring a powerful object or person is absolutely essential to maintain the structural continuity from Infinity War. The narrative needs a clear prize.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the structural predictions are reliable when the foundational premises governing causality are just crumbling. We have blatant contradictions right in front of us from Infinity War itself.
What specifically undermines the structural integrity of Infinity War in retrospect?
The problem is Doctor Strange's foresight. Okay, if the Ancient One couldn't see past her own death because of the limits of the Time Stone, how could Strange, using that same stone, see the final outcome of Endgame after the stone was destroyed? The Time Stone was gone, yet Strange saw millions of outcomes leading to Tony's death in the final battle. It suggests that the rules of time and causality are far murkier than the structural patterns imply. And that instability is directly thanks to Loki's influence.
That is certainly a contradiction that speaks to the instability from Kang and Loki's meddling. But the structural necessity remains. A journey requires an objective, a tangible power source for the villain to acquire and wield.
But what if the objective isn't a physical McGuffin, but a conceptual one tied to resolving the chaos? This conceptual chaos makes pattern-based prediction less reliable than you claim. Furthermore, that contradiction about Strange's foresight, it isn't just a paradox, it's proof that the foundation you're building on is unstable. And it opens up a dark, complex possibility that ties directly into the conceptual threat of doom.
And what is that possibility?
What if Strange saw one of those 14 million outcomes as Tony Stark ultimately succumbing to his own hubris and becoming the next great existential threat? Perhaps even becoming a variant of Doctor Doom. And what if that's why Strange planned for Tony's death in Endgame? He sacrificed Tony to prevent a greater future threat. This level of high-concept planning fundamentally alters the structural integrity of the entire narrative, forcing us away from simple pattern adherence.
I think that moves from prediction into overly complex theorizing. While the conceptual ideas are compelling, structurally, the most likely path is the clearest one. The structural predictions, Doom emulating Zemo's manipulation, the cold opening targeting Steve Rogers, the guaranteed journey arc requiring a central power source, provide a clear, predictable map for the film's narrative. And the Russo style dictates that the antagonist's journey achieves its objective, leading to a cold end, much like Infinity War.
And that cold end, that victory for Doom, is precisely where the mythological depth truly defines the outcome. It won't be a victory achieved through simple acquisition, but through the intellectual persuasion of reality itself. Doom will win, creating Battleworld as you predict, but the reason he wins is because he convinced enough key players, like Doctor Strange, that his terrible solution was the only solution to a conceptual crisis planted by forces beyond them.